Well, I'm not used to that just being up there. I didn't have to touch anything. That's amazing. Thank you all for being here this morning. And we're so grateful, as has already been mentioned, for everybody who's here, especially for those that are visiting us. Some of you are just traveling through. There are other things you have going on. But you took the time out of your trip to stop and worship with God's people. Thank you for that. And whenever you come back through town, we hope that we'll see you again. And then there are some of you that may be here and you're looking for a church family and you've been trying to figure out if this is that place. If you have any questions about the work and the worship that we do here, please talk to us. There are any number of us that would love to answer those questions the best that we can. So thank you for being here this morning as well. And as Byron said, those of you who are members, good job. It's supposed to be here. This last week, it has been a marathon. It has been really, really busy. One of the things that made this week so busy is that Ann and I got to do something that we've taken joy in doing for the last 5 or 6 years. Several years ago, we were given the opportunity to start hosting a weekend workshop for single people in our home. And we weren't sure if we were going to do that this fall with moving and getting into the rental house and things like that. But communicating with some of the folks that had done it in the past, I sent out a survey saying, hey, this may be put together really last minute. Is it still something you'd like to do? You'd have to come to Texas instead of Kentucky. And the overwhelming response was yes. And so we did that. We actually rented a VRBO here in Allen, just like 5 or 6 minutes away. And we spent all weekend going through this series on Backstage heroes. And some of those folks are with us this morning. So get a chance to meet them. And Lord willing, this is something we'll continue doing in the fall of every year. And this is one of the lessons that we took from the weekend. What we were talking about, we started over in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. And in 1 Samuel 16, you have God selecting David as the new king of Israel. Saul has been rejected in chapter 15, and so he's looking for a different type of man. And he sends Samuel to the household of Jesse, and Jesse is expecting another Saul. I mean, he's expecting another man that looks very kingly. He's expecting someone that's going to be impressive. And so he sees the oldest brother, and he's like, surely this is the Lord's anointed. And God says, no, that's not him. And listen to me, man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord doesn't see as man sees. The Lord looks on the heart. And so you look at the package, and you're impressed with the package. The package doesn't mean anything. I'm looking at the inner person of the heart. What is this person's character? And that's something that actually ties into what we read as we were getting ready for the Lord's Supper. Over in Psalm 51, which is David's famous psalm of repentance, he talks about what God values. Let's just look at that for a second. Go to Psalm 51. And what he talks about God valuing is down in verse 17. He says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. I mean, David was not a perfect man. I mean, you read through his life, and he has some really high ups, and he has some really low downs, and he makes some very public mistakes, and there are some extreme consequences that his family suffers from, and the nation suffers from. But through it all, he's a man after God's own heart, because he'll be humbled by God. You have someone like Nathan confront him, and he humbles himself, and he responds to that. He wants to go and attack a Nabal, and Abigail confronts him and calms him down, right? And so God values these people, not just the ones up front serving in very public ways, but he values the people that you don't always see, the ones who might be mentioned once or twice, or the Bible characters where you're not even given a name. But they're valuable to him and in the economy of his kingdom. And so this last weekend, the last couple of days, we've been looking at Bible characters, men and women, that serve the Lord, but they're not the primary character of the story. They're the secondary, or even further behind than that. And so who we want to look at this morning, just for a couple of minutes, is we want to talk about Mordecai. So turn over to the book of Esther. Turn over to the book of Esther, and we're just going to look at a couple of passages. We made the point this weekend that really Mordecai gets more text time than Esther in the book of Esther. And he's introduced in chapter 2, and then the book concludes in chapter 10. Like chapter 10 is only 3 verses long, and it's Mordecai. It's talking about him. And so the book of Esther plays a pivotal role, there is no doubt, but she and Mordecai go together. And Mordecai is the one that's encouraging and instructing and warning Esther. And so you have the story get started where this is several decades, some Israelites that have returned from their captivity, and they've gone back to the land and they've been rebuilding. But there are some Jews that do not go back. They stay in Babylon, and eventually they stay put and they assimilate. And it seems to be that's what's part of what's going on here. And so you have Mordecai and Esther. We don't meet them until chapter 2, but they're one of these homesick heroes. They're away from the land of Canaan. And then there's this king, King Ahasuerus. And all through the book, you have all of these parties and all of these edicts. And King Ahasuerus has this party, and he has all of his buddies, and he's just being really foolish. And he wants to show off how beautiful his wife is, Queen Vashti. And so he tells Vashti to come in so he can show off to all of his buddies. And for whatever reason, in that moment, Vashti was like, I am not that kind of queen. I'm a modest woman. I'm not just going to come in and flaunt in front of your drunk buddies. I'm not going to do that. And so she says no. And what's interesting is all of the buddies say, you can't let her get away with that. Like if she does that, then all the other women in the kingdom are going to do that. No one's going to listen to their husbands. You've got to make an example out of Vashti. And he's like, oh, you're right. You're not queen anymore. Like he removes her from being queen and then comes to regret it later. And so in chapter 2, his buddies are like, oh, we've got to fix this. You're just kind of down in the dumps. You're missing Vashti, aren't you? We need to replace Vashti. And so they come up with this process by which he's going to evaluate different young women in the kingdom and select a replacement for Vashti. And that's when we're introduced to Mordecai, and that's when we're introduced to Esther. So in chapter 2 and verse 5, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. So he's a descendant of King Saul, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So you have this really interesting relationship. You know, at some point in her life, we're not sure exactly how old she was, she becomes an orphan. And the only close family member to take over raising her is her cousin, who appears to be a little bit older than her. And he becomes a father figure. And so Mordecai raises Hadassah, but in the book she's known by her other name, Esther. And she listens to him. She values his input. And so we're introduced to these two Jews who are away from home, trying to be what God wants them to be, imperfectly. They make mistakes along the way. And there's debate about how well they follow the Lord or not. As imperfectly as they live, God uses them to save his people here. You get to verse 8. The king's order and his edict were proclaimed. He's going to come through and make his selection process. And when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best part in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Like, there's just some things about this I don't know the answers to. And if you have some suggestions, I'm open to them. I mean, I'm not really a fan of people hiding who they are. I'm not a fan of that. Like, if you're one of God's people, let it be known you're one of God's people. But for whatever reason, that was a liability, and Mordecai knew that. And so his advice to Esther was, don't let people know who you are. There's a danger to this. You don't have to tell everything you know. Like, don't volunteer that. Okay? And Esther listened to that. How right or wrong that was, I'm not entirely sure. As we were talking through this in the workshop this weekend, we used the illustration of Corrie ten Boom in The Hiding Place. And if you're familiar with The Hiding Place, you've got Corrie ten Boom and her father, and you've got Corrie's sister, and there are these ladies, I believe they're in their 50s or 60s. They've never married, but they're living with their father. They're in Holland, and the Germans are rounding up the Jews. But Corrie and her family believe in the Bible, and they believe what's going on is wrong. And so all the people in their circles are trying to figure out, how do we help the Jewish people? And they were divided on it. So like Corrie and her family, the book is called The Hiding Place. They created a hiding place in their kitchen where you could remove some floorboards, and they would hide Jews who were trying to escape. And then if a German came in, they would say, there are no Jews here. Well, that's a lie. He's standing under your feet. But in their mind, they're like, we're trying to preserve life. Like, they're trying to justify this lie. And then they had other people in their circles that were like, it's wrong to lie. We're never going to lie. So if a German asks me outright, I'm going to tell him, yeah, they're in the floor. And even though that means that person's going to die and I'm probably going to die, like, I'm not going to tell a lie. And so that, like, they wrestled with that. Like, that's a heavy decision. That's a heavy decision. And those are some things that you need to try to think through before you're in the moment, so you can act conscientiously. But I think it was something like that, where Mordecai is like, there's some liability to people knowing this piece of information. Don't tell them. Eventually it becomes known. Like, the timing is important. Eventually it becomes known. Mordecai is a Jew. Esther is a Jew. They end up sharing the information, but they don't at first. And as difficult as that decision is, Mordecai demonstrates concern for her, and he's walking past every single day trying to catch a glimpse of his cousin. How is she? Is she all right? His fatherly concern for her is very obvious. Now, eventually, well, like, we know the story. Esther is selected. And when you look at the process, we use this phrase, like, it's just kind of ick. It's not an ideal process. The king is spending a night with every one of these girls, and even if he doesn't make her a queen, she's made a concubine, and she's considered technically one of his wives. Like, that's a horrible process. I would never want my daughter to go through that process. But that's the process. And like, I wouldn't want my daughter to be one of hundreds of women. Like, we were talking about that in Bible class, in the Genesis class. You know, Solomon had hundreds. That's horrible. That was not God's design. And so they go through this really awful process, and she's chosen. She's chosen to be queen. And she is made the wife of Ahasuerus. And she is given a position above all the other women that have gone through this process. She's the replacement for Vashti. And then we get this little detail in verses 19 through 23, where Mordecai is sitting in the king's gate. He's in some kind of high position within the government. He's sitting in the king's gate. Verse 20 emphasizes Esther had not made her kindred or her people known. She's been listening to Mordecai. She hasn't revealed that information. And verse 21, while he's sitting there, two of the king's eunuchs are whispering, but they're not whispering. They're planning to kill Ahasuerus, but they don't realize they're not using their inside voices. And Mordecai overhears all of that. And he reports it to the king who just married his cousin. And these two men are caught, and these two men are addressed, and like the whole thing is written down in a book for the king to read later. And it's just dealt with, like boom, 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 it happens really fast, it's recorded. And then you just kind of forget about it, but it's going to come up in the story later. And then when you get to chapter 3, you're introduced to a new character. You're introduced to Haman. So chapter 3 and verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And if you're not familiar with your Bible history, there are some things you have to put together here. So in the previous chapter, we're introduced to Mordecai, who is a Benjamite. He's from the same tribe as King Saul. One of the jobs that God gave King Saul when he was king was to eliminate a group of people who were really wicked, and they were the Agagites. There was King Agag. And it was that group of people where Saul did not kill them all and made an excuse for that. He actually preserved the life of Agag, and Samuel had to kill Agag. But obviously some of them had escaped. And now here we are several hundred years down the road, and here is a surviving member of the Agagites, Haman the Agagite. And, their families had met each other in the land of Canaan, and now they're way across, and they're in Susa. They're in Persia. And Haman he remembers all that. He remembers that history. He remembers King Saul. He remembers how the Israelites tried to wipe out all of his people, but some survived. They've been telling each other that story and nursing that wound for the longest time. So verse 1, he's been advanced. Verse 2, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down. And we're supposed to think about this. When you look back at the book of Daniel, you've got Daniel's three friends when Nebuchadnezzar makes the golden image in the plain of Dura, and he tells everybody, when you hear the music, bow down to this image. And you're supposed to picture in your mind's eye all these people, and they hear the music, and everyone bows down, but you've got three Jewish guys going, and they're not bowing. Like they stick out like a sore thumb. And you've got Haman here, and he's rolling through, and everyone's been instructed, when you see this guy come by, everybody bow. And so he comes through, and everyone's like, boop, 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 boop. And Mordecai's like, and he won't bow. And everyone sees that. And they start asking him, what's going on with that in verse 3? The king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. And they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. So Mordecai finally is like, look, I have to give an answer for my behavior. I'm not just flippantly disrespectful. It's not that I don't have regard for positions of authority. I do, but there's something you all don't realize here. I'm a Jew. And that piece of information is supposed to help them understand what's going on. We know what's going on because we know the history. But apparently they're supposed to understand the significance of that too, because he doesn't give any other information. He's explaining there is hostility between the Agagites and the Jewish people. That's it. There's some unresolved business here. In verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. Is filled with fury. And we're going to see this a little bit later. Have you ever been in a situation where because of your prejudice or someone else's prejudice, or because of bitterness, or because of something, everything else in life can be going great? You've got a promotion, you're living in a great town, you've got a good house, things are going good with your family, and one little thing is off, and it just it wrecks your world when it shouldn't. Life is good for him. Everyone is bowing down to him, but he can't get his way on this one little thing, and he's filled with fury. And when you keep going through the text, it's just not your everyday kind of fury. It's not like he gets home and kicks the dog or he slams the door. Verse 6, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him, the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. He didn't come home and out of frustration kick a dog. He came home and started plotting genocide. This one guy will not bow down, his whole family. All of them, everywhere. They're dead. And you need to be able to look at a map of the empires of the world and come to grasp how big that kingdom of Persia was, how large it was, the one that succeeded Babylon. And you have to think about the scope of that, the number of people that we're talking about all over that empire. And how do you get the green light for that? So in verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day. They cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples of the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may be put into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. This, I have a hard time fathoming this. And there are a couple of ways this could have gone. I'm not sure exactly which one is right. Because he picked a day to kill all the Jews. He picked a day, after this day, no more Jews. And he picked it by lot. And I don't know if the way that went down was they sat at a table in the conference room and they pulled out a paper calendar and they're 12 months out of the year, cast lots, this month. Okay, which day? Cast lots, this day. And they did it all in one shot. Or if it was every day for a period of months, he comes into the office and we flip our calendar. He's like, okay, cast the lots. Is it this month and day? And then the next day, is it this month or day? I don't know which way it was. Either way, he cast lots to pick the day. And then once he picked the day, he's like, I've got the day. He's got to get approval. And so he goes to the king and he does not say it's the Jews. He's really vague. He says, hey, there's this people and they haven't assimilated. It's costing you. And we need to get rid of them. And I know it's going to cost money, this is a big project, but I'll front it. You don't have to pay, I'll pay. I'll give all this money and put it in the treasury, and that's how we'll pay to get this done. So you won't be out anything, and we'll remove a problem. And the king's just done. I'm not super impressed with Ahasuerus. He gets his buttons pushed by all these people. It's he's not really reigning. So then the edict goes out. In verse 13, letters are sent by couriers to all the king's provinces about this genocide. Chapter 4 and verse 1, Mordecai learned all that had been done. He knew. He knew it was Haman. He had to assume it was because he initiated by not bowing. And so Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. You have this official going out and making a scene as he publicly mourns. And everyone's like, what is going on with Mordecai? And the conversation, Esther hears about it, can't go to him, but she sends a courier back and forth. And talking about backstage heroes, this is the only place that courier is mentioned. But that courier is faithfully reporting back and forth to Mordecai and Esther. They didn't have cell phones. They couldn't text. There was no email. You physically had to send somebody. And they trusted this person. And Esther reveals, I haven't seen the king in a month. The king has not called for me in a month. And you know the laws. If I go in there when I'm not asked for, and if he doesn't give me his scepter, that's it. I'm dead. This is risky if you're wanting me to approach the king and try to save the people. And this is the chapter where you get the very famous line, verses 13 and 14. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you'll escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The point that he's making, and he doesn't use God's name, but the idea is someone is in control, and someone is sovereign, and someone is working, And he's confident that even if Esther fails or Esther denies this moment, God's going to take care of it some other way. But as he looks at history, as he looks at her story, he's like, how could this be accidental? How can it be accidental that God worked it out that the king's current wife is a secret Jew? That's not accidental. Like, out of all the women he could have chosen, the king chose you. God put you there. And so stand up and let this be the time. So she thinks through it and she plans out how she's going to do this. And she prepares a banquet for Haman and for the king. Doesn't say anything to them then. Haman's head is just full of himself after that feast. And he has another moment where he's leaving the feast and he's like, man, my life is perfect. I have this great job, and I'm promoted, and people love me. The king loves me. I get to eat with the king and the queen. No one else gets to do that. I'm really rich. I've got a wife. I've got a house. I've got kids. I've got friends. And he's walking home. Verse 9 of chapter 5, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Same deal. He is so obsessed with his hatred for Mordecai, it ruins everything else in his life. And he comes home and he gathers his family and he gathers his friends and he says that. He's like, look, I've got all these great things, but Mordecai. And so they plan to kill him. And in the sovereignty of the Lord, the king has been reading the history books, and he remembers Mordecai saved him from an assassination plot. He's like, what did we ever do for that guy? And they're like, well, nothing. And he's trying to figure out what to do, and Haman comes walking in, and he's like, Haman, what do we do for somebody that I love and somebody that I respect and someone that I want to honor? What do we do for that kind of guy? And Haman's like, he's talking about me. And so he gives him all these great ideas, thinking that it's going to come to him. And when he's all done, Ahasuerus is like, that is great. We're going to do that. Go do that for Mordecai. And I want you to do it. And so you see this reversal, and it just kills Haman to have to go do that. And Mordecai must have been so confused when Haman came to him. Eventually, at the next feast, Haman is revealed. Esther reveals him. Haman ends up getting impaled on his own spike in the yard. So Haman is removed, and they can't revoke this edict that's gone out for genocide against the Jews. So they create a new edict that the Jews can now defend themselves, and they end up surviving and thriving. And they start the Feast of Purim, this annual feast celebrating the deliverance of the Jews. But when the story is all said and done, you get to chapter 10, and it's about Mordecai. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all the people. Like, that's a pretty amazing epitaph as you commemorate somebody and what they did. Let's talk through this really quick, right? So you've got this brief biography. We talked about Mordecai and what you think of when you hear his name. It's always associated with Esther, raising his cousin up like he was a father. You have these references that we've either read through or summarized. I mean, it's just the entire book of Esther. We could have spent more time, but we're not going to do that this morning. And you think through, so after studying this, what do I think about him now? What do I think about Mordecai? What kind of person takes in an orphan and raises them and cares for them as their own? Like, that says something about Mordecai. And I know other people that have done that. I know people in this room that have done that. I think that's pretty awesome, and that's amazing. Where you look at somebody and you say, hey, this person needs help. And whatever their age or their circumstances, they need a family. And so you sacrifice and you take care of someone that needs a family. That's what Mordecai did. And if you realize that, you realize as you raise somebody, like being a parent doesn't stop. It changes, but it doesn't stop. Like you're always a parent. You may be a parent of an adult, and the roles change, but you're still their parent. You're still concerned about them. You're still thinking about them. You still love them. You still want to help influence them. Like they're their own person and they're making their own decisions, but you're still a parent. That doesn't stop. Mordecai never stopped. He had some heavy conversations that he had to have with her, life and death conversations. And whatever their relationship was, it wasn't perfect, but whatever their relationship was, Esther respected Mordecai and listened to him. Even when it came to putting her own life at risk, Mordecai had shown her this example of selfless sacrificial love, and then she turns around and does it on a larger scale. And that's pretty impressive. Just some general insights. Think of why Mordecai wouldn't have bowed down. It had to do with his faith. It had to do with what he understood about God's plan for the Agagites. He understood Saul should have finished the job. Think about why Haman was so upset when Mordecai didn't bow. Like, you can't talk about Mordecai without talking about Haman. Mordecai never loses control. All the way through. The only time you see some outburst is when he grieves. But that's totally normal. In contrast to that, you have Haman, who is unstable. He is just all over the place, ruled by his emotions, and will flip. He will change on a dime. But you have Mordecai, who's just stable and steady. And can I say, when you let your life be run by your emotions like that, you're not stable. Like, emotions have a job, emotions have a place. God gave us our emotions. God has emotions. And God expresses emotions in a perfect way. But he never meant for us to be driven and led by the nose by our emotions. Ever. And when you have men, especially men, I'm going to get on the men here for a second. When you have men that are in positions of authority and power who do not have control of their emotions, bad things happen and people get hurt. When they can flip on a dime and chew somebody out and yell and get hostile, that's not Mordecai. And we need more people in control of their emotions, letting their emotions do the job that God gave them to do, but letting truth and letting the inspired word of God lead their lives. Well, let's do this. This is a bonus, okay? Go over to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, you have, this is the last night before Jesus is betrayed and he's arrested. He's observing the Passover with his apostles in the upper room. And in chapter 13, he's washing his disciples' feet. And his disciples are wrestling with that, especially Peter. How can our master, how can our rabbi humiliate himself by touching our dirty feet? And Peter kind of bucks against that. And Jesus just says, hey, if you don't let me do this, you have nothing to do with me. And then he's like, okay, then give me a whole bath. And Jesus is like, no, we're not doing that. We're just going to stay with the feet. Stay with the feet. But then you get to verse 17. When he's all done serving them and giving them an example of service. And let's look at 16 as well. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And so you've got this process here, like this decision-making matrix that's applicable to everything. In verse 17, he says that what should be helping you make your decisions is what you know, what God says, what God reveals, what are the examples he's shown. Jesus has talked about sacrificial service, and he just gave them a real-life example of it. So they have a lot of knowledge about sacrificial service. Knowing is what should be the engine driving this train of life. And then he says, if you know these things, blessed, it's the same word that Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount for the Beatitudes. Happy, you feel something about this, but that's not the next part of the sequence. You're blessed if you do them. And so the decision-making process goes like this. You know what God says. You've seen the examples. You've heard what Jesus says. You need to choose, am I going to follow it or not? Am I going to do it or not? And at the end, the caboose of this thing is you're going to learn to feel a certain way about it. What the world will tell you is put your feelings in front. Make your feelings the train. Do what you feel. You feel something, do it. And maybe think about it, maybe not. Just disconnect your brain, but just feel and do and feel and do and feel and do. And you're going to break a lot of people, and you're going to mess yourself up if you let your emotions run the show. Instead, you let what Jesus has taught you in the example that he's given you. And that's what Mordecai did, right? Haman was the opposite. He was just a hothead running his mouth and got himself in trouble. There's so many character traits that we could talk about when you think through Mordecai. You can talk about his selflessness. You can talk about his trust in the sovereignty of God. You can talk about the passionate way he expressed his grief, how wise he was, the way he communicated with so many people so well, his respect for authority, his respect for life, his loyalty, all of those things, his boldness, his gratitude. He helped start an annual feast expressing gratitude to God that the Jews still observe to this day. I think that's pretty impressive. So many biblical truths. You can look through the Psalms. You can look at Romans. The passages that talk about people providing for their family in 1 Timothy 5, he provided for his family. When she needed a home, he provided a home. You could talk about caring for orphans in James 1:27. Mordecai did that. You could talk about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, talking about blessed are the peacemakers. He was a peacemaker. He was long-suffering. As we wrap this up, like one of the benefits of doing these character studies is to look at their faults, look at their weaknesses, look at their strengths. There's a reason God included them in the text for us. There are lessons that he wants us to learn. And so we look at their lives, and then we're supposed to put ours alongside and say, what have I learned? How can I grow? What do I need to be warned about? How does Mordecai's life challenge you this morning? How can you be more like him? How could you avoid some of his mistakes? Think through the difficulty of chapter 2. How might you do that differently using biblical principles? I'll tell you what, one of the things that he did is he didn't take matters into his own hands. He trusted God with all of it. And God ended up taking care of everything. The idea of what was said about him at the end, that he sought the welfare of his people and for peace. Every Christian should be looking for that for everybody. Because that's what Jesus came to do, was to seek the welfare of everybody and help provide peace, first of all between them and God, but then with everybody else. I mean, think about all of the passages that talk, especially over in 1 John. You cannot say that you love God and hate your brother. If you have enmity and bitterness with another Christian, something's wrong. And you need to do what you can on your end to resolve that. But you can't claim to be a peacemaker and follow the Prince of Peace and live these broken lives. Right? You just can't do that. And so as great as Mordecai is, he's flawed. Really, the ultimate example is Jesus, and we look for Jesus. As we wrap up this morning, just think about some of those things. What conclusions have you reached after looking at the life of Mordecai? I've shared some. And what could you do better? After having learned about Mordecai this week, what could you do better and what could you do different? When we come together in these one another moments, it's not just to say, hey, I broke open the Bible and I heard a sermon and I checked a checklist. Like, that's not why we do this. We do this so that we can encourage one another and rebuke one another and exhort one another as we see the day approaching, right? So we're helping each other become more like Christ. So as you listen to this, how can you do that this week? And if you're not a Christian, that's the first place to start. If you're not in Christ yet, start there. Come to know Jesus and be found in him. If there's someone that needs to die with Christ, if there's someone that needs to put Christ on in baptism and have his sacrifice applied to their account, you can do that this morning. But if you're already a Christian, if there's a way that you've been convicted that you need to change and grow by looking at this man's life but also thinking about Christ, do that. And if you're just kind of wrestling, like you're trying to figure it out and you just need prayers as you figure it out, we'd love to pray with you. But whatever your need is, we can't do that unless you come to the front and let us know. Why don't you do that as we stand and sing? I hope it's built on nothing less than Jesus' blood.